Welcome to Marketplace Live. Let's defy gravity.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for Digital Realty's Marketplace Live event. This is a truly virtual and global event, so I'm really excited to be here to share with you some of the insights that we at Structure Research have been covering for the last 9 months. So this title of this webinar and keynote is called Asia Pacific, the New Center of Data Gravity. My name is Jabez Tan. I am the head of research at Structure Research. We are an industry-focused analyst research firm that's focused specifically on the digital infrastructure ecosystem. So think data center and hyperscale cloud and the ecosystem surrounding that. So really thankful for the opportunity to present to you guys. Thank you for the Digital Realty team for having me here today. Without further ado, I'd love to kick off the presentation by giving you a quick sense of how this presentation will look like in terms of content. It'll be about 20-25 minutes, and I want to cover some of the key trends that are happening over in the Asia Pacific region. So first, we'll talk about the K-shaped growth dynamics, some of the tailwinds and headwinds in terms of industry verticals that have been impacting the Asia Pacific region. Then we'll move on to talk about the digital infrastructure value chain and how that looks like from a projection standpoint, from a segmentation standpoint. And then specific to the Asia Pac region, I think cloud gaming is a very important vertical moving forward for the region. So I want to spend some time talking about the growth potential of that vertical. And then we'll shift gears and talk about the hyperscale cloud growth in the Asia Pacific region and how that's playing out and how fast that region is growing. And then hyperscale cloud growth directly benefits data center colocation operators. So we want to look at the global data center colocation market and then specifically contextualize that for the Asia Pacific region and how we projected the growth for APAC moving forward. And then we'll look at some of the key markets in Asia Pacific through our market maturity index. And then we'll round it off and end it with some key takeaways from the top Asia Pacific markets in the region. So next slide looks at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and how that's really created some digital tailwinds as well as some headwinds from traditional industries. And we'll break down in the next slide what that looks like. And K-shaped dynamic simply means digital industries like e-commerce, video streaming, digital payments, online gaming, social media, and collaboration tools for remote work environments have grown tremendously and significantly, whereas on the flip side, more traditional industries like travel, hospitality, live events, sporting events, brick and mortar retail, offices, dine-in restaurants, oil and gas have all declined in growth because of the inability to meet in person from the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's what we've been seeing play out, not just across APAC, but globally. And I think these trends are not just brought on because of COVID-19, but have already been existing pre-COVID-19. And COVID-19 has simply accelerated these trends, we think, moving forward. And these are lasting trends that we believe will play out in the next 5, 10, 20 plus years. And then shifting into the next slide, which talks about the digital infrastructure ecosystem and how that really plays out from a demand standpoint. So on the one hand, you have these hyperscale cloud platforms like AWS and Microsoft Azure, Alibaba that are providing cloud computing services to enterprises, to consumers, to end customers, and their infrastructure either resides within their own data centers or within third-party co-location data centers like what Digital Realty provides. And their customers, be it Netflix or Zoom or Shopify or Slack or Sony, these guys are deploying, either in a hybrid architecture where they're doing, some of these deployments on hyperscale public cloud platforms, or they're also doing it in co-location environments. So I think the takeaway here is that data center providers have been benefiting as the foundational infrastructure layer, especially so this year because of COVID-19 and the demand for digital infrastructure due to the work from home dynamic playing out. And the next slide really shows how the shift is going to take place over the next 5 years. If you look at how COVID-19 has really accelerated this shift from on-premise infrastructure to off-premise. And simply put this way, a lot of companies and enterprises don't have the expertise, the bandwidth, the resources to operate their own in-house data centers anymore. And so the best way moving forward, as they've realized from the COVID-19 pandemic, is to use an outsource model for the digital infrastructure needs. So whether that be deploying on a hyperscale cloud platform like AWS or Microsoft Azure or Google, or in a hybrid type model with colocation providers like Equinix, or through bare metal hosting in a managed infrastructure environment. All of this is really taking home the point that digital infrastructure will shift to off-premise environments. So we project that hyperscale cloud in 2025 will occupy just under 50% of the total digital infrastructure pie, and that's pretty significant. We believe that acceleration is taking place even this year. And then next slide really captures how we believe cloud gaming and online gaming in general will be a really massive total addressable market and a really massive driver for growth in the Asia Pacific region over the next 5-10 years. And if you look at how these hyperscale cloud players are already investing heavily in cloud gaming. So you have Amazon rolling out their Luna platform, you have Microsoft with Project X Cloud, you have Google with Stadia, you have Sony with PlayStation Now, and then you have these kind of region specific and marketplace specific platforms like Garena and Steam. You have Tencent with Start, and you have Apple with their Apple Arcade platform. That just really shows how much of a massive growth market these hyperscale cloud players expect this to be over the next 5 years. And we'll dive into some of the growth data points that we're seeing even today that helps to really justify that thesis that the growth is already here and the growth is only going to accelerate moving forward. If you look at some of the recent data points from quarterly earnings that we've been tracking, from online gaming standpoint, you have Garena that's growing their quarterly active users at just over 60% year over year to just under 500 million active users, and that's primarily coming from the Asia Pacific region, predominantly from Southeast Asia markets, North Asia and East Asia as well. Similarly, Shopee, another e-commerce platform, essentially the Amazon of Asia, in addition to Alibaba's Taobao, is growing their gross orders at over 150% year over year to just over $600 million in gross orders. And then even from US-based operators, they're seeing a lot of success in the Asia Pacific region. If you look at Netflix, just under 50% of their net adds in the third quarter came from the Asia Pacific region, 7.3 million net adds in APAC as of this year already. So that just speaks to the early signs that growth is beginning to accelerate, and we think that's only going to accelerate even further moving forward over the next 5-10 years. And shifting gears on the next slide, we want to talk about the hyperscale cloud market and the Asia Pacific hyperscale cloud market in particular. We project that the overall growth for hyperscale cloud will be a 35% CAGR between 2020 to 2025. But the Asia Pacific market in particular is outpacing that growth rate. So really the key driver of growth for a lot of these hyperscale cloud platforms will come from the Asia Pacific region, growing at 41% CAGR. So just under $25 billion market for the Asia Pacific region in 2020. That's going to reach just under $140 billion in market size in 2025. So tremendous growth that we're projecting. And I think these numbers are relatively conservative, internally speaking. And so we definitely expect the hyperscale cloud players to either meet or exceed these growth projections moving forward. And then on the next slide, we look at some of the individual growth from these hyperscale cloud providers. So there's a good mix here of large players like Amazon and Microsoft Azure, along with more Asia-specific cloud platforms like Alibaba and Kingsoft. And so I want to point you guys to how, if you look at the red and green growth rates between Q1 and Q2 this year, you notice a deceleration in growth from AWS and Microsoft between Q1 and Q2. But on the flip side, you're seeing an acceleration in growth from Alibaba and Kingsoft, so growing from 50% to 54% for Alibaba, just under 39% to 52% for Kingsoft. And that really speaks to, one, how much growth potential there is in Asia Pacific, and then two, also how well the Asia Pacific region as a whole has contained the virus from a quarantine mitigation and recovery standpoint. And then moving on towards the next slide, which shows the demand trends for hyperscale and how we believe that they will continue to lease capacity moving forward. As you can see, AWS, Microsoft, and Google, although they will build their own self-built data centers in select Asia Pacific markets over the next 5 years and have built them today. We do expect them to augment that with a lot of leasing from third-party capacity. If you look at on the bottom left of the chart where you have kind of those tier 2 and Chinese hyperscale cloud platforms, we believe they will predominantly lease capacity moving forward, given that it's a quicker time to market for them. They're already pretty behind the top 3 cloud players in terms of size and capability. And so I think they will continue to invest more of their capital into their cloud platform capability in terms of AI, machine learning, data analytics versus investing in real estate and buying land. And so I think these trends are very favorable if you're a data center operator. And I think the growth in hyperscale cloud will directly correlate to growth in the data center industry as well. And if you look at how these hyperscale clouds have evolved over time, over the last 5 years, looking at this next slide, where you look at the decentralization of these hyperscale cloud nodes over the last, call it 5 to 7 years, where initially they would deploy their nodes in very few select markets in APAC. So predominantly you'll see them deploy in Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Sydney to start. But fast forward to today, they're expanding and filling more gaps in their infrastructure map moving forward. So you look at Mumbai, adding nodes in Mumbai, in Osaka, in Seoul, in Jakarta, in Perth, and Melbourne. So we think that's only the beginning, and we expect that to further accelerate moving forward as they fill more gaps in their infrastructure map throughout the Asia Pacific region. And this will lend, on the next slide, this will lend to a dual hyperscale market dynamic in certain countries in the Asia Pacific region. I know this slide specifically points out Japan, Australia, and Seoul with regards to Tokyo, Osaka being dual hyperscale markets. Sydney and Melbourne have emerged as dual hyperscale markets. We expect Seoul and Chuncheon or Seoul and Busan to really emerge as dual hyperscale markets as well. I think what's also not shown on this slide is markets like India and China. We have Mumbai and Hyderabad and already Shanghai and Beijing being already dual hyperscale markets from some of the largest Chinese platforms out there. And then shifting gears into the global data center colocation market on the next slide, our growth projections show that the data center market will grow at a 10% CAGR between 2018 to 2024. So from just under $48 billion in market size to just under $70 billion. And that growth is primarily driven from the Asia Pacific region as well as the EMEA region as overweight in terms of growth rates moving forward. And then looking at it from a 5-year standpoint, the North America market today represents around 40% of the total data center market size from a colocation standpoint. According to our projections, the Asia Pacific region will surpass the North America market by 2021, and will reach 40% of the total market size globally by 2024. So really the changing of the guard, we expect that to happen over the next 5 years, and Asia Pacific will really start to shine as the new center. Again, the new center of data gravity we expect to be come from the Asia Pacific region moving forward. And the next slide shows some of the key markets within Asia Pacific. So if you look at very mature tier 1 markets like Tokyo, Singapore, Hong Kong, Sydney, Tokyo being the largest in terms of market size from a critical megawatt standpoint, which is really how we measure the size of a data center market. We don't usually measure it in square feet anymore, given that power is now more often than not the limiting factor within the data center. And so Tokyo being the largest market, followed by Singapore, Hong Kong, and Sydney. And then you have these kind of emerging markets in APAC that have the potential to be tier 1 markets. So if you look at Seoul, Osaka, Melbourne, Jakarta, all of these markets have the potential to be tier 1 markets moving forward. And then even on the next slide, as we look at data center capacity from a country standpoint, you definitely see that China is still the heavyweight and will continue to be the heavyweight in Asia. But markets like South Korea, Indonesia, and India, like I mentioned before, really you'll see it start to catch up in terms of market size and start to look more like tier 1 markets moving forward. And so I think the key reason why Asia Pacific is going to outpace the rest of the world in growth is because it's really got a great combination of very mature tier 1 markets like China, Japan, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, but also these emerging markets that have the potential, again, to be tier one markets. And that's unique to Asia. And that's, you don't really see that dynamic very much so in markets like Europe and North America as of this point. And then the next slide shows our market maturity index. So this is a newly published index that we've been trying to do to give our readership and our clients a sense of where does each market stack up within the Asia Pacific region in relation to each other. I know there's so many markets to cover, but I want to point you to two main sections within this index that I think are worth breaking down. So on the top right-hand corner in red, you have some of these more established tier one data center hubs like Tokyo, Singapore, Sydney, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Beijing. And based on this chart, we've continued to believe that these markets will continue to outperform over the next 5 years, high upside markets, but also very mature markets, and also very competitive markets. And then in that kind of blue quadrant just outside these tier one markets, we call that the opportunity quadrant, which is really where I think some of the key growth markets will emerge over the next 5 years. And so, from this chart, as you can see, we're very bullish on markets like Mumbai, Jakarta, Osaka, and Seoul being these kind of very high growth and high upside markets with not as much maturity as some of these tier one markets. And then you start to see markets like Taipei, Kuala Lumpur, Hyderabad also start to emerge as hyperscale markets, as I mentioned before, as these hyperscalers continue to roll out their infrastructure expansion. A lot of these secondary and tertiary APAC markets will stand to benefit, we believe, moving forward from the growth that's coming from these hyperscale cloud platforms. And so I want to wrap up today's webinar and keynote by talking about some of the key themes that we're seeing in the top markets across Asia Pacific. So I want to start with Singapore, which is experiencing a current moratorium on new data center builds amid strong demand. And so I think there's currently, we believe, still enough supply in Singapore, but that supply is quickly being absorbed by hyperscale demand. So there's 4 large hyperscale data center builds coming online, and we think that the Chinese hyperscale demand in Singapore will continue to accelerate. I think we've seen, that regionally, from a regional standpoint, ByteDance and Tencent have publicly announced Singapore as their new regional hub. I think given the current political tensions between the US and China and bans coming out from India for Chinese apps, that really puts markets like Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, and Japan in a good place to really benefit from Chinese hyperscale demand moving forward. So we believe Singapore will continue to be a market with very stable demand, a safe haven for a lot of these hyperscale cloud platforms as they expand throughout the Asia Pacific region. And then moving on to the Hong Kong market. Hong Kong has had an interesting story this year due to the new security law, resulting in some uncertainty surrounding large hyperscale and cloud content companies that are non-Chinese speaking. And so I think, what we see from Hong Kong is that we think that the primary driver of growth for Hong Kong moving forward will be these Chinese hyperscalers from mainland China looking to expand further or expand internationally and using Hong Kong as their first jumping off point, as a gateway for them to expand to international markets. So we do expect there will still continue to be demand from Western hyperscale cloud platforms, but that will be, I think, somewhat muted in the near term due to the current uncertainty regarding the law, the new security law. But we believe that will be offset by lots of demand coming, not just from the tier 1 Chinese hyperscalers like Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei, but some of these tier 2 Chinese hyperscale cloud platforms are starting to really grow and reach a certain point of scale where they can and will start to expand internationally. In the Australia market, we do see stable demand moving forward from hyperscale clouds, with very favorable competitive landscape dynamics because of Australia's geographical isolation from the rest of Asia. It kind of limits the ability for these hyperscale cloud platforms to deploy in markets in Australia and being able to serve multiple kind of international markets. So Sydney, Melbourne would be the primary hubs to serve the Australia market. But then we're also seeing Perth emerge as a hyperscale gateway into international markets like South Asia, Middle East, and Africa as well. And then wrapping up with our last Asia Pacific market, and arguably one of the hottest data center markets in 2020 would be the Japan market. And that's really driven by very nascent demand. I think if you look at the Japan market in terms of market size, compared to more mature markets like Singapore and Hong Kong, there's still a lot of runway for Japan in terms of hyperscale cloud demand and expansion moving forward. And we think that's going to be primarily centered around Tokyo's Inzai region and Osaka's Ibaraki district as some of these key hubs for hyperscale expansion moving forward. And I think Japan also has its fair share of barriers to entry, given it's got high build costs due to a labor shortage there and a declining birth rate. And also because of the surge of demand entering Japan, there's been some power infrastructure build out delays, which has kind of limited the amount of new capacity that can come online within a given year. So I think that's going to help the market be more disciplined in its build out, and you'll see, I think, more and more data centers being built in the Japan market. So I think that's it. That covers most of the topics that I wanted to hit on, with Asia being the new center of data gravity moving forward. Really thank you for joining me today. Thank you for taking the time to listen in. And really also want to give a shout out and great thanks to the Digital Realty team, specifically the Digital Realty APAC team for having us and me on this webinar today. So hope you have a great day and enjoy the rest of the sessions today. Thank you.